Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined this post-primary election day by Josh Blank, the Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. I was going to characterize that as a quasi-hysterical chuckle.
I'm a little tired. It's getting a little... It's Friday, right?
Yes.
It's Thursday.
Physically and mentally tired.
Yeah, a little bit.
But, but excited and as ever enthusiastic.
Oh, for sure. Hey, we have more information.
More information, generally better.
Right.
So, we've been anticipating Tuesday's Texas primary election for months now, or at least many of us have. And the results, to some degree lived up to the anticipation. I mean, I think we sometimes dine out on going, let's not over-dramatize. But, interesting things have happened.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. A bunch of incumbents got knocked off. I mean, we'll get to the details, but, the speaker's in a runoff. Everybody who, spent money and endorsed is crowing about how powerful they are or how powerful somebody else is in some cases.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, at least for a time of the year that can often turn out to actually be pretty quiet, it's pretty engaging, at least for, sort of people like us, right?
Right. So if you're listening to this, as we often say, your email inbox and text messages are already filled up to the brim with summaries and revised summaries and reactions. So, we're not going to dig too deep into that. We'll start with a few of the by the numbers looks at the outcomes. But mostly we want to talk about impressions of implications, what it all means, doesn't mean, and these are not hot takes. They're still kind of warm.
Yeah.
I think flagging our sense of fatigue.
Yeah.
I probably need to not think about this for a while and then think about it again some more.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And of course we'll throw in a little bit where we can about, what polling has told us or didn't tell us about what happened. So, a few top lines. 9 GOP incumbents were defeated outright, gone, in addition to the several that had chosen not to run again. There's going to, by current count, and there are a couple that, may be challenged here. So, but broadly speaking, 18 legislative runoffs by most counts, 16 in the House, 2 in the Senate. Most notably, and the biggest headline for the hashtag TexLeg crowd, Speaker of the House Dade Phelan faces a runoff after finishing about 3 points behind challenger David Covey, backed, of course, by Attorney General Paxton, by Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and, a host of the sort of far-right / insurgent Republican crowd. I think something that got, attention in the political press, but probably, kind of a sleeper in this in some ways, just by the nature of it.
Right. Challengers
to 3 incumbent judges on the Court of Criminal Appeals, all of whom were supported by Paxton and his allies, were defeated and defeated outright. In the only real marquee race on the Democratic side, Colin Allred won a ticket to challenge Ted Cruz by easily passing the 50% threshold in a crowded field. State Senator Gutierrez finished second, last I saw, with just under 17%. A little better than he was polling. I think not a winning, and not to be giving trophies to all the kids, but kind of a decent showing.
Yeah, I would say,
given what he had to work with.
Yeah, I think ultimately, there were a lot of things working against Senator Gutierrez. Mainly in particular, honestly, being in the legislature the entirety of last year and not running, not, raising money in the same way.
Yeah.
He was limited in what he could do, and to really get close to, 1 in 5 voters or so in the primary, even if it's a very low turnout primary, not a bad showing.
Yeah, and we should know, that was a, free ride is a little too flip. But,
Yeah.
the point being, Senator Gutierrez will return to the Senate as he wasn't up for re-election
Right.
this cycle. Donald Trump, unsurprisingly, sails to a clear victory with a little more than 1.8 million votes, which was 78% of the vote in that particular race. And again, we've talked about how to talk about the Nikki Haley candidacy, but I don't think you're being particularly anti-Trump or pesky or overestimating or overplaying Nikki Haley's position to note that, she got more than 400,000 votes.
Right.
About 17% when she was, clearly not going to win.
Right.
Right. And so, we talked about this, I think, a little bit last week in terms of, or maybe the week before, thinking about what Nikki Haley is up to, what its significance is. You can put a pin in that for later, but I think it's worth noting. So we should add here, based on the list of Trump endorsements, while we're on the subject of Trump, in case we don't get back to it. And the list I had came from Lieutenant Governor Patrick, I think, via social media the day before the election. Trump endorsed 16 House candidates, including 3 incumbents, all 3 of whom won. Mm-hmm. Overall, 11 of the Trump endorsees in House races won, 2 lost, 3 are in a runoff, and that includes, of course, David Covey in the Phelan race. Joe Biden was even less opposed in his race, though with anemic Democratic turnout. He won close to 85% of the Democratic vote, but that was only about added up to a little more than 826,000, I think 826,400 and something votes. So, oof.
Yeah, not a great place to be starting.
In terms of, Democratic turnout in the state, which was very low. So, let's talk about a few things. And, for our crowd, let's start with the speaker's race, which
definitely.
Dave Phelan's race in his district, to distinguish between 2 possible subjects here.
But you know what? We'll come back to that.
Yeah,
So I think that's actually an interesting part of this.
I'm just trying to be,
yeah, sure, a little precise.
A little precise, kind of precise.
That's the podcast 2.0.
Yes, kind of precise. A lot of questions here. What does Phelan's failure to win outright mean for him?
Right.
What does it mean for the House? And broadly, relations between the 2 chambers in the legislature going forward. To just start with the obvious. No matter how you spin it, I think if you're, in the kind of paid advocacy position, you might say, well, he made a runoff. This is, not very many people are saying this, but one might look. At least he made it to the runoff, given the millions arrayed against him, and the great forces and the meddling of other statewide officials, quote unquote, et cetera. But look, this has to be interpreted as a sign of weakness, and I think the general sense is that, not only is his seat in danger because he's an incumbent going into a runoff, which is not a good position to be in by the numbers historically. But even if he prevails, his speakership is certainly in jeopardy.
Yeah, this is one of the few instances in this podcast where it is worthwhile to sort of bring in some of what political science says about these kinds of things, which is, when you look at the people who are in the leadership positions in legislators, whether you're talking about the Congress or you're talking about state legislators, you're usually talking about people who are in unequivocally safe positions in their districts. They're so safe that they can spend time raising money for other people, helping other candidates fend off challenges. And the thing about, and this speaks to his overall weakness here, 1, he couldn't defend himself, regardless of the forces arrayed against him. But 2, he wasn't very successful in defending many of the House members who were, basically out on a limb on a couple things. And so, not to say that, Phelan could have made a difference necessarily in some of the voucher holdout districts, but, when you're looking ahead to thinking about, the calculation of your modal Republican House member right now, Phelan might look like more of a liability than a shield to you at this point.
Yeah, and inevitably, in the, whatever the, the old cliched saying about, success has a million parents and failure has none or something.
Right, no, yeah.
I'm not going to feel bad about not being able to remember that old saw, but, it's going to raise definite questions about how the speaker and his team handled the politics of the last couple of sessions, and I think that's fair, right? I mean,
it is,
particularly the matters that were the fulcrum. Right. If you want to, for those of you at home, there's a certain amount of maybe I kind of agree with that, but let me particularly on the fulcrum. Of the political mobilization against incumbents, the issues that were the fulcrum of the mobilization, education issues writ large, specifically ESA vouchers, et cetera, and the Paxton impeachment. I mean, there was a headline this morning, I think it was in the Texas Tribune, but I'm not sure. If it wasn't, I apologize to the dailies or whoever else that wrote it. There's probably more than one, to the effect of, and I paraphrase, this is not in headline form, but, Phelan made the gamble of his career on the Paxton impeachment and seems to have not paid off. But look, this is about, and to be clear, I'm talking about the politics, not the policy and how the politics were handled. Right. And that's going on. So,
yeah, no, I mean, it's tough because on the one hand, I do think, look, Phelan is by no means, from conversations I had, like a perfect speaker in terms of the way he's handled the politics of the chamber or even these two particular matters. Having said that, it's tough when you look at his record, right, and you look at how much conservative legislation the House has accomplished over the last few sessions under, his speakership. It is, and we'll get to sort of institutional ramifications here, but it is sort of interesting that really you can kind of point to these two things and say, well, he messed these up, and if he'd probably not messed up one of them, he might have been safe. I mean, he was close. He was very close. I'm not saying.
I think.
I don't want to say messed up, but I mean, I was just messed up.
I'm doing my head from side to side.
Well, when I
messed
say that,
up.
I mean, he messed up the politics of it.
A Monday morning quarterbacking.
Yeah, I mean, managing the politics of it, and I'm not saying that voters came out and turned him out because he oversaw the impeachment of Ken Paxton, but it added fuel to the fire that was already there, and it's always there to remove.
Well, and let's tease that out. And I think we talked about this. We've talked about this a little bit in the run-up, and it's good to kind of reiterate this point afterwards because I think it's important. And it's one of the reasons I said, handling the politics. One of the things that came out of our February polling and was consistent with what we had gotten in the run-up to, election season, quote unquote, was that you had to consider the fallout on these two issues and these two, strategic decisions, in a more holistic way rather than, trying to find a direct correlate in public opinion because, we know that, in numerous items, when we asked people in the last poll, are you looking at Ken Paxton's endorsement, for guidance? Almost literally nobody said that.
Right, and people weren't paying attention to barely had heard anything about the endorsements, period.
Right. Yeah, people had not heard a lot about the endorsements. Now, primary voters did, likely primary voters in the sense of the most conservative and the most Republican did tend to report that they were more likely to have paid attention. So we should say that. But even among those primary voters, we also know that when we asked about issues, very few people said, oh, you know what, I'm going to vote on vouchers or I'm going to vote on the Paxton impeachment. So now that gets to the point, I'm just kind of fleshing out that point you were making that I think is important is that, it's not that this didn't have an impact because we saw elite and interest group mobilization around these issues. But those were not, hopefully there'll be somebody, if we had infinite resources, we would do this. Right. I would love for somebody to gather all the political advertising, content analyze it, and see what was in the forefront of that advertising.
Well, I got it
because I got the impression from what I saw. I was in North Texas the weekend before the election. Saw a handful of ads, and people were not playing either the Paxton impeachment or vouchers per se in a very direct way, but that's impressionistic based on what I've seen and what I've seen in social media, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think this is something that, I got asked, we've been doing a lot of media interviews in the last few days, and it's been very interesting to see sort of the questions get asked. But one of the questions that I think has sort of been asked, me at one point was, well, I know that your polling has shown that, vouchers is not a high priority issue for a lot of Republican voters. A lot of people didn't mention it as an issue that they cared about in the primaries.
What happened?
What happened? Well, it was sort of what happened. It was almost, the question was almost to the effect of, did more voucher voters show up? And sort of there's this way you sort of turn it around or something, or has Ken Paxton been vindicated by this? And I think, you meld these points together is important here, which is to say, voters didn't talk about this as much. They were much more focused on other issues on the border. The candidates in those districts, in most cases, were much, much more focused on the border and on other sets of issues. And it's not to say that those issues, and just to lump them together, didn't impact these races. They clearly impacted these races, but they impacted these races in both, I think, generating challengers,
right,
creating distinctions, which is really important and hard to do when, again, most of these House Republicans have voted lockstep, really on all of the key issues in the last couple of years. And so this was, this created the conditions, and it created, I think, I would say coalitional elements that were then aligned against some incumbents, including the speaker, right?
Right.
But in and of themselves, would you say, is this what voters reacted to? And I would say, no, I don't think so, both because of what the candidates were talking about, as you point out, as anybody who looks at the ads points out, and also what they told us.
Well, and there's and another,
sort of fine distinction, but it's important.
We'll come back with Speaker Phelan and talk at least about some data for a minute.
Yeah,
but one last impressionistic piece about that also is that, I think my impression, and if folks want to send me an email or whatever, I'd be interested in if others share this impression. But it feels to me that during the campaign, and especially now in the day after, where people are angry, and outright pissed off and kind of speaking their minds, and we have social media now, and a lot more people saying, people are, calling, high-level elected officials in the state liars very directly.
I've seen that.
A lot of they lied.
Right.
Right. And I think, you saw that. And I think that speaks to this. And some of the ads that we've seen have been accusing incumbents of being soft on border security, for example.
Which I'll just say, crazy.
Right. Does not stand up to the record.
Well, all right, if you want to put it that way. I'll just say crazy. But
right.
Sure.
And so, that's another element here that is kind of, and I think is going to have to be, would also be an interesting thing in terms of some kind of a comprehensive roundup or content analysis. How frequently did we see people say, this person, abandoned X, or, particularly, and look, border security is the big question.
Right.
When I see ads saying that this incumbent was, Republican incumbent, was soft on border security, to use the phrase, popularized in the last election cycle by Amy Klobuchar, I'm pretty interested in seeing the receipts on that because I don't think they're going to have them. Right. I think, oh wait, I must have thrown it away.
Yeah.
So
I'll get those to you on Wednesday.
And so going back on the, going back to Dave Phelan for a minute, we've talked in here a lot, and it's a indication of, certainly, my you're younger than I am, certainly my generational socialization. But, the Phelan position, and I don't want to overgeneralize this, does kind of raise the issue, what I think of as the Laney rule about, and it is a saw. So it's whether it originated with Speaker Laney or not, I will leave it to my betters to adjudicate that. But once you're above 50% of people knowing your name as a Speaker of the House, you're probably in trouble because, you're not, to academicize it, you're not leveraging the benefits of the office, given that in some cases, this is where anonymity is actually your friend in a lot of ways. And we've talked in here a lot without, rehashing it, that has gotten harder and harder, I think, starting probably with the Strauss speakership. Yeah. Which happened at a point of, the rise of social media.
Yeah, exactly.
Solidification of one-party rule and infighting in the Republican Party to, all these other things that probably changed the context and made that rule, if not obsolete, but harder to respect, right? And our numbers show that, that Phelan had crossed that threshold.
Yeah, it makes that rule harder to respect, but it's not even in that per se. In some ways, look how many speakers we've seen since then. Yeah. Right? One of the questions kind of going forward, I was sort of joking with a friend, after on Wednesday morning and sort of saying to myself, given all that Phelan actually delivered on and, his sort of likely demise, at least as Speaker, if not in the House, it's sort of like I was kind of, offhandedly said, who would want this job? And he quickly reminded, everybody wants this job,
right.
which is right. But it's also like, but it shows how hard it is, right? I mean, because it's one thing to say, well, Democrats are criticizing the Republican speaker. Yeah, boo-hoo, of course. It's easy to ignore that, and especially if you're a Republican voter, super easy to ignore that. What if it's the lieutenant governor? What if it's sort of backhandedly the governor? What if it's the former president of the United States? And what's weird, and you can kind of almost see, both how the 50% rule is probably true, but also this other feature of this, which is that we always sort of talk about, state elections getting nationalized, right?
Right.
And when this happens, how it's sort of like, all the sort of things that we know about the state politics they don't necessarily go out the window, but they sort of take a back seat to whatever the broader dynamics are. And it's hard not to think about Phelan's race taking on state level overtones in some ways, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't really about, Phelan's representation of the district.
I think it's the only way to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't about Phelan's representation of the district. This was about, these sort of state level conflicts, these conflicts between these actors. And now, I mean, what's sort of crazy, and I'm just sort of like trying to wrap my mind around, is you've about 33,000 voters who voted in his Republican primary who are now eligible to vote in the runoff. So
Which is pretty high.
And yeah, very high. And, I mean, that's the whole thing about turnout. That's also another interesting discussion we probably won't have today. But, 33,000 Republican voters. And for those who don't know, you should know on this podcast probably, you have to have voted in the Republican primary to be eligible to vote in the Republican runoff. So 33,000 voters are about to be bombarded with I think tens of millions of dollars to basically try to get them to come back out. And I mean, that's just really, talk about the nationalization of state politics, but this is like talking about essentially
Right.
what is a small statewide campaign taking place in a district for 33,000 votes.
Right. And there's as we're talking about this, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but there is an interesting thing that's going on with, a lot of different causes as we're kind of getting here about, how hard it is to head the Republican coalition as a presiding officer in a legislative chamber.
Yeah.
For those of you that do comparative state work,
Yeah.
none of whom are probably listening, but, but please, it's an interesting question,
It
right?
is.
I mean, in terms of looking at So, as long as we're talking about people and there's a follow-up here really, and bringing up the Trump endorsement, what is there to say about Attorney General Ken Paxton's night? I mean, clearly a good night for him, a victory for him. Again, there's going to be a lot of credit claiming that's inflationary here from, candidates to political consultants up to the leading officers of the state, leading statewide officials in the state. Given is how many people he endorsed, et cetera, as you were saying, we were discussing beforehand, a lot of these victories come in races that were a little overdetermined.
Right.
Or, some of these members that were defeated were, on the vulnerable side.
Yeah.
Right. Or the less strong side, shall we say. Mm-hmm. And with a lot of money that was spent, that none of which was the attorney, most of which was not the attorney general's. Right.
Yeah, I mean, we already talked about, so I think we're not going to sit here and say that his impeachment didn't play a role in these primaries and both creating the rationale for challengers to emerge, but also this potential sort of differentiator. Right. But, when you think about, looking now that we get to the end of this cycle, we see where the money was spent, and you think about, what was Paxton's direct involvement in this? And it seemed like his direct involvement was relatively limited in the legislative space. I mean, it's not to say he wasn't campaigning for some people, but I think one of the things I kind of noted was, the Collin County delegation did pretty okay. Yeah. I mean, of the Republicans at delegation, only one went to a runoff. Leach and Shaheen are still there. Candy Noble's still there, escaped. So, I mean, not, he didn't have a clear and obvious impact, especially even in the area where he was expected to maybe have the biggest in terms of sort of the conventional wisdom about their power in that county.
And I don't have it all in front of me. And a lot of those Collin County races were not particularly close. I mean, a couple of them were, but I think a couple of them,
they were close. They were as close as they were like last time. I mean, it was you're at about 2/3 of the vote. I mean, they were competitive. They were competitive, but they weren't close.
Right.
And I think to the extent where you look at where Paxton was sort of most directly involved and had the clearest impact, it was in those judicial races. But even that, that was a shift in strategy kind of late that in some ways, at least to my read, and I'm putting my hands up and saying, to my read, was an indication of the fact that I think there was a recognition that Paxton wasn't going to play a big role in these legislative races, not necessarily because he couldn't have played a role in some of those races. I mean, they were already being overdetermined just because there was Donald Trump's endorsement, there was Greg Abbott's money, there's a bunch of other stuff going on.
Yeah.
But in these races where you've got, down ballot races, low knowledge about who the candidates are, and the attorney general making a recommendation about what judges you should elect, which is pretty tight,
Right.
reasonable thing to consider. This is where he was most effective, but it also seems like telling if the goal is to make it seem like you're effective to say,
Right.
okay, let's go focus on this
Well,
now.
and you remember, I mean, he's, in both personal and at least potentially on personal issues and on policy issues, the Attorney General has been at odds with the Criminal Court of Appeals. And
Yes.
so there was some incentive there in addition to the, kind of the cherry picking that you're implying there. And my question is, and this is another thing I've got to look more into because like most people, I'm not, I pay a lot more attention to legislative races
Right.
than judicial races. But for those of that follow these races, I mean, look, there are people that mobilize, that are closer to the judicial system in these races.
Yeah.
Interest groups in that space, et cetera. I am wondering if this is going to have a little bit of a demonstration effect.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but I mean, if I was a political entrepreneur and I'd be kind of, hey, look, seems like those races are a little ripe for, you get a lot of bang for your buck, if you will.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether this sort of change it's not going to be a change in the partisan composition of the court most likely, but this change in the makeup of the court, if not its partisanship, is going to lead them to, essentially flip on some recent decisions that they very clearly made about his office's ability to unilaterally prosecute voter fraud cases,
Right.
which is not the only thing that this was about, but it's a big part of what this was about.
Well, what it is a good transition because
great.
I also want to talk, in a lot of ways, I think the stuff I've been thinking about most and need to clear my head and rethink, but think about more. But, what the institutional kind of bigger picture takeaways are. I mean, and key in my mind, is just another demonstration of how, Governor Abbott's strengthening of the governor's office and the executive branch, which I'm, beating on in the podcast and it's stuff we write all the time. Both in absolute terms, in terms of just increasing the centrality of the executive branch of the governor's office, and vis-a-vis the legislature, is aligned here with an exercise, an exercise is of increased political power that goes with that. And look, Greg Abbott is no stranger to intervening in legislative races. It's been a source of irritation for a while with some people, and certainly with some legislators. But I mean, as we noted going in and as we look at now, the scope of that intervention and the focus of it and, its orientation really, to me, becomes a part of that story. And the story being, the augmentation of the role of the governor's office, the role of the governor in the political system, the role of the governor vis-a-vis the legislature, even amidst this, uptick in, this exercise of power by the lieutenant governor. And if you look at, just looking at the win-loss thing, I think the general sense here is at least explicitly, Abbott endorsed 14 Republican House challengers, and we're setting aside all the incumbents, which, as you say, sort of lower hanging fruit.
Yeah.
Of the 14 he endorsed, at last count, 7 won outright. 5 drove the race into a runoff. Only 2 of them lost. Smaller group than what some others were involved in, but a pretty good batting average.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when the money numbers came out last week or 2 weeks ago, I guess, and you saw, how much money Abbott was pouring into some of these races, at that point in time, my feeling and kind of what I said was, it doesn't really matter. I mean, whether he has a great batting average or he doesn't have that great of a day, ultimately, he's made it incredibly costly financially, time-wise, to oppose him on anything, whether or not you were even in his crosshairs. He's made it very, very clear. But when you take his win rate, even if some of those were already vulnerable incumbents, whatever the situation is, doesn't really matter. It really multiplies the impact of that on the legislature. And to your point about this sort of habit strengthening of the branch, the sort of talk about the institutional implications or ramifications, it is really getting hard to think. Strangely, I mean, almost overnight, you'd say, so what are the counterweights to Abbott? at this point? I mean, is it Dan Patrick? Is that where we are now, where Dan Patrick is the major counterweight to the governor in terms of sort of the policy direction of the state?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, and I mean, well, and the only way that that's anything but true is if the House comes back, at the beginning of the next session, and picks a speaker.
Throws in with the lieutenant governor.
Well,
right?
no, there's there's two. Well, that's another way. Actually, I was going to say two. I mean, I think that's a possibility.
I think it's not a very close possibility, but it's not zero.
What's the thing? There's sort of two possibilities that are not very close, but not zero. And one is, they nominate someone else again who's going to, quote unquote, stand up for the House. Right, kind of the sort of someone who's come from the House is sort of the way people talk about it, respects the institution. I'm putting this in quotes, that kind of thing. They could throw in with someone who's closer to the governor, I guess, in which case, that'd be an interesting session. As you said, they could throw in with somebody who is closer to Patrick, but I mean, that's pretty hard to imagine, in a lot of ways. Nonetheless, I mean, we'll talk about, how that's
the question is,
out.
I think on that, to pose it in an oversimplified way, does a certain amount of fatigue with constantly fighting the Senate and Patrick outweigh the kind of institutional imperatives and the culture of the House,
right? Which
is, has always been, disposed to not be pushed around by the Senate.
Now, we'll say though, I mean, I don't love, I don't love talking about like the culture of the House in the sense of like the social scientist in me is like, oh God, what are we talking about?
Yeah.
But when you do think about the idea of like the House's identity and not being pushed around, well, you just replaced a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that sort of institutional sort of whatever you want to call it, in most cases, that leaves with that. And you bring in new people with different ideas about what this look like, why they're there, who they owe that to. To
defend this, to slightly defend the academic, notion, intellectually defend talking about the culture of the House is that, there are means of institutional socialization.
Right.
And, how durable are those in the face of powerful counterpressures? I think that's how I would pose that.
Yeah, and powerful shifts in the makeup of that House, right?
Yeah, as a slight. Well, but that's the thing.
That's the question, I guess.
That's the question, right?
Right.
Do the forces of socialization? How do they meet, the changing orientation of infusions of new members? And I think, look, historically, I think what we've seen is the last time there was a big test of that, I think the socialization of the House won.
Right.
That is when we got the big infusion of, when we saw the big shift that accompanied the Tea Party movement, election of Obama, Tea Party movement, elevation of Dan Patrick and allied forces.
Yeah.
We still saw, a House that seemed predisposed to fight the Senate and some of the Tea Party members becoming socialized into the House.
Right. Yeah. So,
but this will be another test of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's going to be the toughest test of that at all because I think to your point, there is a lot of fatigue in the House. I mean, I'm sure it would be nice to have a speaker who had a better relationship with the lieutenant governor. However, it's hard, having watched the lieutenant governor interact with the House in the last few sessions, to say that his orientation towards the House, and let's just say his animosity or acrimony or whatever kind of negative word you want to attach to it towards the House, was solely a product of Dade Phelan.
Well, I think that's right, but I also think he, being the skilled politician the lieutenant governor is,
sure,
he didn't express it that way.
Yeah.
He did sometimes. I think when he was not being careful, there was a little bit of, guys at the House. And look, I can tell you from knowing people in the Senate, there is that attitude over there, just like there is the other attitude in the House.
Right.
But that said, what I would say is that Lieutenant Governor Patrick has done a strategically good job of cultivating some House allies and building a pool of allies that are more disposed to him ideologically and therefore, in some cases, institutionally, and singling out the speaker and a couple of people around him as the problem.
Right.
And, as we parse this out, on the other side, there is the other center of gravity, which is the governor, who is just coming off having, defeated several House incumbents.
Right.
And made it clear that, he was, he also wanted to, as somebody I was talking to about this recently said, kind of put a collar on the House, a collar and a dog chain on the House, right? Which is also not appealing.
Yeah.
So, does the House, what is the will of the House, I guess, and all of this is a way of thinking about it. And, in terms of thinking about what this then looks like going in, we should kind of notice in, the House and Abbott and the governor's motivation apparently in getting involved in this, which partially still a mystery, although it's worked out for him. If you look at the no votes on vouchers last time, and who was on the ballot, of the people that had not retired, 6 of them won outright, 6 of them lost outright, and at last count, with allowing for the fact that a couple of these may be recounted, et cetera, and 4 are in runoffs, and that's added to the 5 no votes on vouchers that retired, or chose not to run again, technically speaking. So in terms of thinking about what that struggle is going to look like, where Abbott is going to be positioned, what the composition of the houses look like, Abbott got is very close to turning the votes, all things being equal, assuming things about the challengers. But most of the challengers in the open seats that are either in runoffs or won all appear to be either neutral, an unknown quantity, or inclined towards vouchers, the way I looking at. But as we were talking yesterday or the day before, I guess it was yesterday, interestingly, some of these contestants for open seats, their position on vouchers, particularly in these rural areas,
pretty hard to find,
is a little understated, shall we say.
Yeah.
I mean, we went to one of the candidates' websites, and I looked at every page on that website and could not see any indication of where this person was on vouchers.
It may have been updated yesterday.
Yes, it is.
We'll see.
So, so there's all that going on, right? What else to say? What are the, we've kind of talked about the implications for the Patrick Abbott House dynamic and all this. I mean, I guess that's kind of what we were just talking about. And I think, that is a very interesting question. And look, step back, this goes for the speaker thing. We're not going to know too much definitively about this, not only until after the primary or after the runoffs at the end of May, but really until after the general election. Now, we don't expect the composition to change a lot. There's going to be a lot going on in the the general election that we're going to be watching.
I think, the one thing you can say, setting aside, policy goals or anything like that, is, the House as an independent institution is a big loser in all this. I mean, both through replacement and, positioning vis-a-vis the other actors, right?
Yeah, that's a good way of summarizing that discussion. I think that, this really, look, I mean, in the longer run, if we look back to, the short-lived Bonnen speakership, the demise of that, how the demise came about.
Right.
The 2 Phelan sessions and the internal politics of that, and there's a degree of unsettledness in that, and a lot of questions at the time about, look, to be fair, about how the House was being run in response to all this. I think a fair view was that, one, as we've raised already, one could question some of the decisions that were made in terms of political strategy for the institution. But you question them in a context that was, it was a difficult context.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
I don't want to feel like we're just kicking somebody who's down, but I think that's a fair read.
Yeah. I mean, look, it was a historical year in the legislature for a lot of reasons, right?
Right.
So, hard to lead under any circumstances, to be fair.
And, to go back to your earlier point, and one of the things we started with, and to the degree that politics in the legislature and in the state are increasingly, subject to national pressures and national influences, a pretty difficult environment in the Republican Party right now.
Yeah, I mean,
and difficult for Democrats for that matter, but certainly difficult for the Republican Party right now with, Donald Trump is a very powerful free radical out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when you look out into the sort of the atmosphere and say to yourself, which, Republican leader has it easiest? And it's kind of like, I think Dan Patrick, right?
Well, yeah.
I mean, he's developed, a Senate that basically, will follow his lead as he sees it, as he sees the politics of it unfold. And that's, a lot more latitude and freedom than you can really put on a lot of people. Right?
Yeah, and I think it's worth going back to what we were talking about in October, and when we saw that the internal politics in the Senate around whether to convict Paxton or not.
Yeah.
And the strong suggestions of the degree, and look, the indication from the lieutenant governor herself of where he stood on that.
Yeah.
And, I think, a pivotal moment in this trajectory is that speech, as I think about it, is that speech that the lieutenant governor gave after they immediately after the acquittal and, in the process of sort of, adjourning the court such as it was, in which Abbott came out and attacked Phelan. Patrick came out, attacked Phelan, attacked the House leadership.
Right.
That pretty much sort of set the stage for where we were going in terms of both the acquittal and both the approach. And again, everybody commented on it at the time that follows these things, the directness of the attack on the speaker.
Right. Yeah.
Which, of course, leads us to where we should, probably close it out. What does this tell us about the Texas Republican Party, the Republican Party of Texas at this moment? Headlines screamed in several places about the moderates losing. We talked a lot about the fractal sense of this. And, but there are indications that we have to say that, it makes sense, at least in terms of the candidates who won and who lost yesterday.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, describing what are so clearly otherwise extremely conservative members as moderates because of their opposition to vouchers or their vote to impeach Ken Paxton, which almost every Republican in the House cast. It's best either oversimplified or at worst just a mirroring of the campaign rhetoric that was designed to discredit them, right? But at the same time, and you look this up, it was great. If you look at the ideological placement of House members that our colleague Mark Jones does using DW nominate scores, which is a way to sort of map ideology into legislatures, which again, very, very controversial, at least within this community sometimes, because people tend to think of it like if you're not the most conservative, well, then you get criticized for being,
stipulating that members on the less conservative end of this, they even hate that I can say that.
Right. Exactly.
Really just hate this.
Yeah. Because language gives no better way to describe the fact that these are still very, very conservative
and
members.
It's complicated. And again, to give our colleague Mark Jones a little bit, he every time he publishes one of these things, there's all the boilerplate caveat language that's been on there. This is relative.
Yeah.
The spectrum, if you look at it, there's not much spread here.
Right.
But it doesn't matter. And that's and it's a fair objection.
Sure.
That it requires a lot of explaining. Nonetheless, it doesn't make it invalid.
And nonetheless, to the point, most of the members who either didn't run for re-election, are in runoffs right now, or lost, are in the 2/3 or so of the relatively less conservative part of that distribution. Another way to put it is, if you were in the most conservative part of that distribution, the most conservative third, you're fine.
By and large, you didn't have much problem.
You didn't have much problem, exactly.
Right, and I suspect Mark will do this, but maybe we'll try to get it together in the next couple weeks. I mean, it's just clear as rain. If you go and you print a copy of the graphic for that distribution from the DW nominate run, there's nothing going on at the top, for the top third of the graphic, which is the more relatively conservative
Who's the anchor?
end.
Who's the anchor? It's Toth,
and then of the anchor at the top is Steve Toth.
Yeah, Toth, yeah.
And then the anchor at the bottom is Guillen.
Yeah.
There's just no action until you get about a third of the way down, and then all of a sudden you start noticing, there's somebody who lost, there's somebody who's in a runoff.
Right.
There's somebody, there's some, they decided not to run again to spare themselves the pain and discomfort and inconvenience and irritation. And it's just very clear. Yeah,
and I'd also add in another dimension to that. It's clear in the sense that there's no activity in the third most conservative, but it's also really spread out among the bottom 2/3. So it's not as though, you go from the quote unquote least conservative members and just start counting off from the bottom up or something like that. That's not what was going on either.
No, I think that's a good point. It's not like you get, as I've got it in front of me, it's not like you get more instances the closer you get to the
it's pretty
quote unquote middle. It's spread out among that whole
which is a reflection of actually in a lot of ways the geographic components in this.
Right. Another way of thinking about that is, there's at least several that are, not several, there's 3 or 4 that are to the right of the mean.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So.
Okay.
So, that said,
yep.
I still think that dynamic was, this dynamic has been going on for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I still think that, the extent of it is amplified by these personal and institutional conflicts, not just to, stick to the original position no matter what. But I think if you're going to understand the intensity of the conflict, I think this is pretty consistent with the way we were talking about it running into this, that, the backbone of this conflict probably still is ideological conflict and the fallout of the opening up of, the party in a further right direction.
Yeah, I just want to be clear because of the way we talk about this, ideological conflict in the service of agenda control.
Right. And
an agenda management.
And personal and institutional interests.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
Yes.
Look, I think people, you can disagree about the degree of that, but, think about the fact what this would have looked like if there had not been a Paxton impeachment.
Yeah.
Or think about what this would look like if the voucher bill had passed.
Right.
There would just not be this much action.
No, absolutely not. That's right.
Right. And those are, or, if what would have this looked like, and this is all now, interrelated.
Yeah.
If
endogenous, if you will.
Endogenous, if you will. I was trying to avoid that. But,
there's a lot of endogeneity
actually collinear,
here.
right?
Yeah.
Or, there's covariance here, if you want, I think. But, if these guys had all been, to use one of the favorite, touch points of, the old hands here, would this have looked like this if everybody had been kept going to breakfast for the whole session?
Right. Or at all.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
No, and I think, one of the questions that falls out of this is like, assuming,
and that's not just, they did not stop going to breakfast, the big three, because said, I just can't stand with being hanging out with a squish moderate.
Well,
or I can't stand hanging out with somebody who's, such a right winger. That's not what was going on.
No, that's right. And this is sort of what's interesting about, the consequence when you think about this, right? Let's just assume for the sake of this discussion that, Phelan is not the speaker next time after all of this, whether he wins the
and that's
runoff
just
or not.
Hypothetical.
But, you ask yourself, do you expect the next speaker to be more or less conservative than Phelan was? Phelan, who, again, oversaw a lot of conservative legislation. But if I'm thinking to myself, who is the next speaker candidate who can get, first, the majority of the Republican conference, and then the question becomes how much of a majority does he get to make it hard for people to sort of hold back, let's say, right? Which I think is a dynamic we're watching. You think that speaker candidate is probably going to do a couple things, right? Probably going to fund the Paxton settlements, get it out of there, be done with it, I would think. Probably
interesting.
I'm just throwing it out there. You kind of just have to fund it and move on. You're going to be, supporting a voucher program, right? If you want to maintain some kind of, good relationship with the governor and not make this, the center touchdown of a lot of conflict again. This assumes a certain amount of just fatigue in the House, right, in terms of dealing with these things.
Right. I think that's a big assumption. It's not a terrible assumpmption, but, we'll see.
We'll see. Again, and I'm going to,
see what the mood is.
Well, I'm saying this, and I'm trying not to make hot takes, but we're just thinking right now, I'm just going to throw stuff out there and just, forgive it. But it's like, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a much, more divided vote than we have in the past on who the speaker is going to be, because I also don't think that speaker candidate is going to be supporting putting Democratic committee chairs anymore. I think that's going to be a hard sell with how many new members have come in, basically, that this is kind of a big litmus test issue, at least among those groups. And then the only other thing I can think of, and this just speaking to the fact of how much conservative legislation they pass, how much further can the House move to the right? I would say, how about taxpayer-funded lobbying? You think about what are the things that could necessarily be sort of the necessary conditions.
Right.
To pull together.
What's the next set of unifying issues?
And that might be, what we would call an establishment Republican in the House who has ties to the far right. But it seems to me those are the sorts of things you'd almost have to say, yeah, I'm willing to, entertain a voucher bill. I'm willing to entertain, no Democratic committee chairs. I'm willing to entertain killing, taxpayer-funded lobbying.
Well, and I think
that's a pretty big shift.
While we're talking about internal things, I think there will also be a discussion again of, procedure and the degree of centralization of powers and authority of committee chairs as part of that discussion. I want to wind up, but let's, I will also add, and I was talking to some people about this. I think, I'm not sure what I think about this, but to the point of the nationalization of politics, I think what the climate looks like, depending on who wins the presidential election, is also going to be a pretty
Huge.
big factor. And I think in the past we've kind of underestimated that to our disadvantage.
Yeah.
In that, for example, as you're thinking about what the issues are going to be there and what's going to bind people together, look, if Donald Trump wins, border security becomes a different kind of issue. If Biden or the Democrats win the White House, border security, we're going to see yet more spending on border security, and that's
I think we're going to see.
unifier.
I disagree. I think we're going to see either way, because one of the things someone was pointing out is Trump unusually was giving Abbott a ton of credit for the work he's been doing on the border. And I would say obviously he doesn't see a rival in Abbott, because Abbott's made very clear that he's not trying to be his rival or get on the national stage anytime soon, at least in a contrary position to him. But if you think about it, Texas has been so much more quote unquote effective in its attempts to address border issues than the Congress is likely to be anytime in the near future.
Effective in the eyes of...
Well, I put it in quotes. I'm saying effective in the eyes of actually...
Of the constituency, a certain constituency,
Well, I would say even passing legislation, right?
And I might have been a little too specific in saying we're going to see more spending, but in other words, but the valence of that issue is going to I expect to shift at least a little depending on who's in the White House.
I see a partnership between the federal government and Texas that has Trump doing things outside of Congress because Congress isn't going to act, and using Texas as the lever.
But that's a lot different than if it's a Democrat and you're just going sticking the middle finger at those guys and saying, well, I guess we got to just keep going on.
Well,
unless Biden and the Democrats, and this is where the national outcome matters. We can, without parsing it to death here, what is Congress, who's in control of what House of Congress, who's in the White House. All of that is, going to seep into this as a logical consequence of this nationalization that we're talking about, right?
But I was just adding that because you made a good point there. And I want to say, in addition to these other things that I think may be sort of table stakes conditions for whoever the next speaker is, the idea is like, what else are they going to do? Well, there's plenty to do, right?
And yes. And so I think I'm going to wind it up there. We'll come back. We will probably take next week off for spring break unless something really that we have to talk about happens, and it would have to be pretty big at this point.
Yeah.
So, thank you all for listening. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Thanks to Josh, as always, for being here. As always, you can find results, interpretations, data of the things that we discussed in the podcast today at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thank you all for listening again, and we'll be back soon, but not that soon, with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.